We've started to see some examples of coaching desperation across the NFL, and my question to the Miami Dolphins is, when will you show us yours?
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting, author of Touchdown Miami on Substack, NFL staff writer for A to Z Sports. Want to give a special welcome and shout out to our everydayers, because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it. Here on the Locked On Network, today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5. And if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. Welcome to the Tuesday edition of the program. Again, we're playing with a little bit of house money this week because the Dolphins don't play till next Monday. So 6 days. The Dolphins will play their fourth of 17 scheduled football games in the regular season for the 2025 season. And no changes at this point for the Dolphins. And it became apparent after the Sunday week 3 games by lunchtime on Tuesday. It's 1 p.m. and I'm recording this. We've already had 2 major changes reported across the NFL. We've had a head coaching deferment of play calling duties, and we've had a quarterback change. And every team's situation is a little different. But I wanted to highlight these changes and then put it through the lens of, like, what can the Dolphins do? What kinds of signs of amid a slow start, are you just going to shrug your shoulders, tuck your hands in your pockets, and be like that cool guy meme who's like, I'm just a cool guy who had a bad draw and played the Colts and Bills in the first 3 weeks and made a few mistakes against the Patriots? I think if you do that, you're lying to yourself, personally. But it is time for the rubber to meet the road as it pertains to results in 2025. And I understand there are challenging elements that make the distribution of blame difficult. It's hard. But I went on the Joe Rose show this morning with Joe Rose and Omar Kelly. And Omar asked for my opinion of, like, how we got here. This rebuild from 2019 and how you've gone into this is the start of year 7 of the build, right? From 19 to now. 19, Kyle does math live on the show. 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. Year 7. I nailed it. You obviously had 3 years with Brian Flores. This is now year 4 with Mike McDaniel. And the fact that it's so challenging to disseminate the blame, I think, underscores part of the problem that you have, which a lot of the successful programs across the league have had people that have come in with a unified vision, and they've executed that unified vision. The Dolphins in their build started with Chris Grier and Brian Flores picking a quarterback, and they didn't agree on the quarterback. And you might think they got the quarterback pick wrong. You might think they got the quarterback pick right, and they got the coaches wrong, or they got the personnel around it wrong, or they didn't put the right focus on the right area of the offensive depth chart to have the best group to maximize the quarterback. I don't care what side of the fence you sit on. I got my opinions, but it's not about my opinions right now. You got 3 years in to the build, 2 years with that quarterback. By the 1.5 year mark with that quarterback, the head coach in question was looking at other quarterbacks. They wanted to trade for Deshaun Watson the entirety of 2021, right? And so the Dolphins choose. They make a choice. They say, we think our general manager and our quarterback are still in the same wavelength. Let's remove a piece and put a new piece in to give us that direction. And it's grown. And now you're at a point where Mike McDaniel's perspective would probably be, you hired me to come in here and maximize a pre-existing personality in a quarterback. You hired me to come in and work with a general manager. Like, I didn't come in here and have that influence on those elements of my ability to do my job. And there's people that I know think that that Mike McDaniel showed enough in the early years of his career that he should have the opportunity to continue to coach the team with his choice of quarterback and a general manager that is aligned philosophically with him. And I think you can have that conversation, but I don't sit on that side of the fence because you've made enough pivots. You make a pivot here. You had your original plan. I make a pivot here with coach. I make a pivot here with how we're going to use our draft capital and how we're going to build our roster. And then I believe it was the piece that Marcel Louis-Jacques had that said this season is not just playoffs or bust. It's about showcasing the ability to execute the kind of strategy or go about doing things a different way. Chris Grier said I'm not sure we were winning in the right way, right? You're content to put up with it because you're winning, but once you stop winning it at a certain degree, you look and say, we're not winning the right way, so we need to change our course of doing business. So you compromised your core values at the beginning of the build. You had to change the coach halfway through. Now I've got a quarterback in year 6 who through 3 weeks has not performed to the standard of what you'd expect, especially 4 years in the same offense. He doesn't look like the same player. In several ways, he's regressed into the player that all of the talking points that were inaccurate when Mike first got here, he looks like that player. He looks like he's proven those talking points more accurate now than when they were being said. It all creates this muddy, coagulated mess of blame and fault and excuses and perspective. And the truth is always somewhere in the middle between the two polar ends and extremes. And there's redeeming qualities about every party involved. And I know everybody's mad right now, and I want to be abundantly clear. I'm mad too. I'm mad about 0-3. I didn't think this was an 0-3 football team. I didn't think last year was an 8-win football team. But there's things behind the scenes that we don't see, and it transcends just names on paper and recognizable talent level, right? But I want to make sure that if I'm mad, I know what I'm mad at. And I want to be mad at the right things for the right people. But when you've had so many deviations off the original script, in my opinion, it's impossible to isolate appropriately and properly distribute responsibility for where you're at. Tennessee. Brian Callahan's 20 games into his career. I think he's 3-17. Not only 3-17, like in games, he's like 3-17 against the spread. Like they don't even perform when you're handicapping their games. That's how bad Tennessee's been. They're 0-3. Callahan was fired off the Zach Taylor tree and brought in, and they said, we want you to run our offense like the Bengals run Joe Burrows. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Sounds like the Dolphins hiring Joe Philbin or the Dolphins hiring Adam Gase. Hey, non-elite piece of why this thing is elite and works. We want you to replicate being elite somewhere else without the pieces around it that make it elite. So now 3 games into year 2 of Brian Callahan's tenure after they spent like 4 years alternating firing coaches and GMs. Brian Callahan's already done the coach's equivalent of a players-only meeting. I'm no longer going to call the plays. It's going to be Bo Hardegree, and I can be more present is the argument. Okay. But it underscores you got a general manager that just came in here and picked, but the coach transcended the general manager. And then the general manager before transcended the coach. And then the coach before that transcended the general manager. And you got to go all the way back to John Robinson and Mike Vrabel. And then they fire Robinson and keep Vrabel. And then they hire Rand Carthon and then fire Mike Vrabel. And then they hire Brian Callahan. And then they fire Rand Carthon and hire Mike Borgonzi and keep Brian Callahan. And then they pick a quarterback amidst all that mess. And now you've got Brian Callahan on the hot seat. Titans fans calling for his job nonstop. The Dolphins aren't to that extreme, but you've had the deviations from the original vision, and you didn't hold it. And some of that responsibility goes on Chris Grier. Some of that responsibility goes on Brian Flores. some of that responsibility goes on how Tua Tagovailoa performed when he first got here. And it's just festered. And it makes it, I think, even if there's pieces that you can still see having pathways to success, in some cases, like Daniel Jones going to Indianapolis, in some cases, it's probably just better for everybody to turn the page and start fresh with a unified vision. Speaking of Daniel Jones, the Giants also on this list of urgency across the NFL. We'll talk about that next here on Locked On Dolphins. Make sure you guys stick with us. Caffeine just got a flavor upgrade. 5-hour energy shots deliver tasty caffeine in 17 bold flavors. Each 2-ounce shot packs the caffeine of a premium 12-ounce cup of coffee plus B vitamins and nutrients with zero sugar and zero crashes. What I love most is it can fit in your back pocket. So when you're on the go, you've got a big taste in a tiny shot. You can take it anywhere and get that boost wherever you need it. I love how fast it kicks in and that it's sugar-free. I like to not drink my calories. I like to eat my calories. So that's just that little extra added bonus as well. Enough with the boring, flavorless caffeine. It's time to give your caffeine a flavor upgrade with 5-hour energy shots. Get the favorites you love, or be bold and try something new in store and online at 5hourenergy.com or Amazon today. Speaking of Daniel Jones, now in Indianapolis, his old team, the New York Giants, announced today that, or it was reported today, after Brian Daboll left the door open yesterday, Jaxson Dart, the team's first-round draft choice, is going to start at quarterback in Week 4 for the New York Giants. This is another example of urgency that exists across the league and another lever that you can pull. For Brian Daboll, Russell Wilson, they signed before the draft. He starts the first 3 games. He throws a boneheaded interception just before halftime to take points off the board. And then you're down 2 scores in the final 4 minutes and you're in the red zone. And Russell Wilson's throwing the ball out of the back of the end zone because he doesn't want to throw any more picks. Brian Daboll was one of the hottest hot seat coaches at the end of the year last year. They brought him back because the argument was, I need somebody to run my offense. They let him pick a quarterback in the first round. Now, what gets dicey is if this doesn't work, and then Brian Daboll and presumably Joe Shane are out, you're hiring a new coach and a new GM, and they didn't pick the quarterback that's there. And that same thing is at play for the Tennessee Titans, because now you're looking at a GM hiring a coach to try to tailor for Cam Ward. And in some cases that works. For Mike McDaniel and Tua Tagovailoa, that worked for a while. It's the evolution of it that we are seeing have a hard time take flight. Right? The original book, and I don't think that makes it a gimmick offense, because I think that's kind of the lay way to describe when something works at first and then it gets caught up to and you're not able to properly evolve it the way that you need to. I don't think that makes it a gimmick, but I think that creates more challenges from a coaching perspective, the style of football that you want to play. It tests your patience, and then the quarterback in question, and in this case it's Tua, with what his tangible strengths and weaknesses are. You're trying to add new layers to his game, but your menu of what that looks like is more narrow than it is for other quarterbacks because he's such a skill-specific player. And the concern is if he doesn't show the growth, well, there's certain teams that can take away what you do well, but even that doesn't prepare you for what we've seen from Tua thus far this season, which is significant, what has felt like significant regression in at least 2 of the 3 games. Never mind the end-game sequence against New England. I thought he played a better overall game in that game. But against Buffalo and against Cincinnati, like the execution of the stuff that's made him so impactful hasn't been there. And if that regression sticks throughout the season, we're going to have a real short conversation about what's the right move for the Dolphins as it pertains to the quarterback. Whether it's Zach Wilson, whether that's drafting a guy, whether that's another reclamation projects from somewhere else across the league. That could be a whole 2 weeks worth of programming. And I don't want to have that conversation before we're ready to have that conversation. But all that stuff would be considered on the table. But then that gets you back into the frame of what the Giants are dealing with now. Say the Dolphins beat the Browns, and say the Dolphins beat the Jets twice. Let's say the Dolphins beat the Panthers. Let's say the Dolphins beat the Saints. And let's say the Dolphins beat the Bengals without Joe Burrow. Let's say the Dolphins beat the Patriots in the rematch. Right? I know I'm forgetting it. Let's say the Dolphins beat the Falcons. That's 8. The Falcons looked horrible in week 3. Michael Penix looks bad. Right? Let's say you have that kind of season. Do you cling to that and say, hey, very clearly the quarterback regressed? Now, I don't think you can have a general manager who picked him is there for a second contract, a coach that goes up to the owner's door and knocks on the door and asks to get the contract done, and then the quarterback flops and nobody pays the price for it. I don't think that can happen. And if that's a world that we end up living in, let's hope not. Because I see very little coherent thought process with the proposition that you could get to the end of this year and the only guy that would take a fall is Tua Tagovailoa, right? And he'll probably be on the roster next year, and I have my thoughts on what that looks like, and I'm planning on doing that video with the contract laid out on Touchdown Miami this week, just because that's not really a Locked On Dolphins conversation, because Locked On Dolphins, there's a video element, but some people just consume the audio version of it, and following around when you're talking about chunks of money and how to classify them and what the exit ramp looks like and all that. That's not a audio only experience, and not everybody who consumes Locked On Dolphins watches on YouTube. And I try to be considerate to everybody who's on either side of the fence on how they choose to consume the program. I digress. This is where it gets messy, is if you win enough games to buoy the pressure, but it's clear something has to change. Are you going to put yourself in the situation where the Giants are in with Jaxson Dart, and Brian Daboll says 3 games is enough? I can't have Russ throwing yeet balls out of the back of the end zone because he doesn't want to throw any more picks and get his interception ratio up and get his passer rating down. I got to play Jaxson Dart. And then what happens if Jaxson Dart doesn't show the growth that you want? I got to fire the coach and the GM, and the quarterback's going to be there and looking around like Will Smith, the Will Smith Fresh Prince meme. And he's like, everybody who's part of the football operation brain trust that picked me is gone, and I've been here a year. Like that's not a consistent pathway to success. And there is no guarantees to success in the NFL. That's what makes it hard. You could do all the right things. And I think there's been stretches where the Dolphins did, I think the 2020 and the 2021 methodology and approach with the draft and supplementing it with free agency and maybe going after a guy or 2 guys, or like the start of 2022 when Tyreek Hill, if you feel like he's too good of a talent to pass up, he could be a transformative player. And then you sign Teron Armstead. Okay, but then you double down on it with Bradley Chubb. Then you got your draft picks taken away for tampering stuff. Like, it snowballed on you and you lost the plot. So process versus results, one thing that I feel really good about saying is allowing, like the Giants did, allowing a lame duck hot seat head coach and general manager pick a quarterback is not good process, because now you're throwing Jaxson Dart out there in a fit of desperation to try to take the pressure off of you to try to save your job. The Dolphins don't have that at their disposal, but if they're not careful, they can end up finding themselves in those shoes depending on how this season plays out. Which brings us to what lever the Dolphins can pull. And I think you look at some assistants, but in my opinion, it would all just be performative. Like, what are you going to do? You fire Frank Smith? Frank Smith doesn't even call the plays. You could ask any fan who's not inside the building, hey, what's Frank Smith do throughout the week, and what's Frank Smith do on game days? Hell if I know. I don't know. Mike McDaniel calls the plays. Mike's resisted calling the plays or giving up calling the plays, like Brian Callahan has already done in 20 games, so that he can be more present in the operations, because he's bungling. They're taking out of 2 timeouts. They're taking delay games to kick 57-yard field goals. Now, has Miami been that bad procedurally? At times, yeah, but I don't think with consistency they've been that bad. But all of your staff changes feel performative to me. Now, the Falcons fired their wide receivers coach. They just got shut out 30-0. They're moving their offensive coordinator, Zach Robinson, from the booth down to the sideline. Respectfully, like, does that stuff really change your trajectory? I don't think so. And that's why I think when you ask what the Dolphins can do to show their desperation, it's a very simple calculus to me. We're going to get into that next here on Locked On Dolphins. Make sure you guys stick with us. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel is making sure you are ready for kickoff with a can't-miss offer. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. I love using FanDuel because it fits however you like to bet and play, whether that's player props, whether that's same-game parlays, whether that's jumping in live as the action unfolds. It makes every game more exciting, whether you're watching the Dolphins on a Thursday or a Sunday or a Monday, or you're keeping an eye on your fantasy lineup. It's quick, it's easy, it's the best way to add a little bit more energy to your Sundays. So if you are ready to play, download the FanDuel app right now. Go to FanDuel.com. Get started. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet. If it wins, then you will get $300 to use across the app. The Dolphins right now on FanDuel Sportsbook for Week 3 against the New York Jets are favored by 2.5 points at home. So don't wait. Get in on the action today at FanDuel.com. The desperation move for Miami is you need to win. And you need to win often, starting now. Because there is a deadline at the beginning of November that I think is very meaningful. And it requires a serious conversation. And what happens over the next month, I think, is going to be very significant in determining where you are at by the time that deadline rolls around. I'm, of course, talking about the trade deadline. Here's the thing. If the Dolphins beat the Jets and then they beat the Panthers and then say they lose to the Chargers, but then they beat the Browns, that's like the next 4 weeks worth of games for the Dolphins. That would get them to 3-4. Then they would have Atlanta and the short week at home against the Ravens before the trade deadline comes. I think it's the 6th. And then you've got Buffalo. That's the first 10 games for Miami. So you can sit here and you can do this little song and dance of, oh, you win at home and then you beat the Panthers and then you're 2-3, but then maybe you lose to the Chargers and you're 2-4, but then you beat the Browns and maybe you beat the Falcons and maybe you're 4-4, but then you get the Ravens coming to town on a short week on a Thursday and then you get the Bills. We know how that game's going to go, right? Until you prove otherwise. So I think your best case scenario for the Dolphins, because you have the Chargers, the Ravens, and the Bills kind of through the first full week in November. I think these games against the bad teams can be the straw that breaks the camel's back. If the Dolphins lose to the Jets on Monday night, is that all she wrote for Mike McDaniel? I don't know. But I think if he wins, then I think he buys himself another week to try to get the team to continue to climb out. And then if they beat the Panthers, then you're at that chance they get back to 500. And then I think if you start to upset, if you log an upset somewhere against a team like the Chargers or a team like the Ravens, let's just start through that juncture, right? The first 9 games. Because that through 9, you're going to have a winning or a losing record. You're already 0-3. I think if you get to Halloween and this team has a winning record, that would mean that this team went 5-1. I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but I think that's the pathway for you to say, hey, trade deadline's here. We're standing on business. Like, we think this team is growing and showing growth in the right ways. I think the worst thing that can happen is you beat the teams you're, air quotes here for those who are YouTube listeners, supposed to beat. Jets at home, Panthers, probably the Browns, right? Because that would get you to 3-4 after the Browns game. And the Browns look like a tough out right now. They're playing great defense. Panthers off a big win against the Falcons, but some of that I'm just a little leery on Atlanta and their offense. But winning those, say hypothetically, those 3 games, but then losing to Chargers, Ravens, Bills, regardless of whatever way the Falcons game breaks. Like, that keeps you floating in it close enough where now you've got the argument to say, hey, we're close, stick with us. We'll have the breakthrough in the back half of the year. I don't want to do that. Right? You're going to sink or swim, and you got to start sinking or swimming now. And I think if you see the losses pile up from here and it snowballs, then that's where I think Stephen Ross, and I think he would have had a justification to do it after week 3. But the team came out, played hard. Okay, I respect that. You see players that haven't quit on your team. You're invested in the coach. You like the coach. I respect it, regardless of whether or not I agree with if it's going to get better in year 4 when it's been some of this stuff's been problems for 3 years and counting now. But if the losses pile up from here, you are watching coaches across the league make whatever moves they can to buy themselves a little extra leash. The Dolphins, in a bid to buy themselves some extra leash, are not going to trade away talent that is not a part of the future because of age or cost or a combination of both. And that's where I think you have a pretty firm deadline to know something will have to have changed within your football operations. I don't think Stephen Ross can call Chris Grier and Mike McDaniel and say, you guys got to trade Tyreek Hill and one of your defensive players by the deadline. We're 2-8, 2-7. Like, I don't think you can do that. Not in good faith. And if you're going to do that, you might as well just make the change anyway. Because if that's what you've resided to, then I think at that point you look at the big picture and you look at the risk and reward of doing half-seas. We don't want to do half-seas. We want to do it right. So either this group is going to get their gig line straight and they're going to pull themselves up by their bootstraps over the next month and a half and score at least one win, if not multiple wins, over a team that is going to be favored over the Dolphins. Either you do that and you justify having the rest of the year, or I think you're going to get to the trade deadline. And my argument to Stephen Ross would be, if you feel you have to impress that this season is lost and personnel moves need to be made for the long-term benefit of the franchise and organization, then you've already got the writing on the wall and you need to make whatever changes you need to facilitate that so that that gets done. Because this nucleus, like a coach or a quarterback, a Daniel Jones can go somewhere else, have a happy break, and find success somewhere else. And the team in New York, maybe they find a different quarterback is a better fit. And the clean break is good for both parties. But the nucleus of this team and the state of affairs that it is in is going to be the starting point. And if you're going to do a hiring process, if that's where you find yourself, you have to make the job as attractive as possible, which means you need to give it as many assets to work with moving forward. That's cash, that's cap, that's draft picks, as possible. You don't want players on the tail end of mature contracts with a lot of non-guaranteed money that those players are going to want to have their contracts restructured or more guarantees given to them or all that stuff. So I'm looking at the next month. Jets, Panthers, Chargers, Browns. And I think that stretch, and then you could throw Falcons and Ravens in there because they're all October games. Next 6 games. I think have to define, you have to have your answer by then. And if you have your answer and your answer with the group that you have is no, then you need to, in my opinion, you need to do what's possible, what's needed to ensure that this team can get aligned to be an attractive job as best you can. And I understand there's some contracts. The Tyreek Hill personal conduct policy might be restrictive. I understand that. The Tua Tagovailoa contract, I don't think you're going to have anybody jumping or chomping at the bit to trade for it. I have my thoughts on how to best navigate that. Again, that's not a Locked On Dolphins discussion because it's a very complicated, nuanced, a lot of numbers, moving parts conversation. But the urgency you have to show as a team, because you don't have a symbolic giveaway, I think, and I certainly don't think Mike is going to give up play calling duty. You don't have a player to bench that says, here's my desperation play. Here's my ace in the hole. Here's my card in my back pocket. Your desperation has to start on Sunday, Monday, and you have to win. And you have to win more than you lose. ASAP. That's my 2 cents. Kyle Craps. Keep it locked in here on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. Appreciate you guys for checking the show. Talk to you all again tomorrow.